When I was growing up, right, the telephone was still something that you had to go take off the wall and you'd go shh, shh, and you prayed the person you were calling didn't have too many zeros, right? Because that was the longest way around, right? And so that was the telephone. And they didn't even have long cords when I was growing up. It was a short cord, and you had to go to a stationary place in the house where the phone was, right? That was my upbringing. You played, if you played outside. You played in the dirt. You made mud pies. I won't take this a survey to see how many of you made mud pies. And you got out there and played, for crying out loud. And then when you were home and there were family guests, I wonder how many of you had this kind of upbringing. Of course, we had no television. They didn't have TV in South Africa until the late 1970s, long after I'd left. So no TV. There was one radio station, was South African Broadcasting Corporation, and they basically broadcast news and weather. And so there was no radio programming to speak of. I was sharing with a friend this last week. We were talking about some of the rock and roll songs we grew up with. And the first rock and roll song I even remember was you could faintly get an FM station from Mozambique, and they were playing "These Boots Are Made for Walking." Right? Nancy Sinatra. How many of you? No, you won't even. Don't raise your hand. You're up. First rock and roll song I ever remember hearing. So very little radio. So when the family would get together, and particularly when we would have guests, we had a missionary to Mozambique whose name was Mr. Kidman. And I remember Mr. Kidman and Mrs. Kidman, they'd come visit. And of course, then around the dinner table or after the dinner table, what would you do? You'd sit around and tell stories. Right? And I remember just loving, in those early days even, loving stories. And of course, as a kid, you weren't allowed to speak. You had to be quiet. You kids were to be seen and not heard back in those days. And so I would sit there. I know it's hard for you to believe that I actually sat quietly, but I would sit there with my siblings were all older than me. Most of them were gone already by the time I was in my 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age. And so we would sit around as a family. I'd be sometimes the only kid there, and I would just sit and absorb all these stories. Right. I remember Uncle Jack Stead, I've told you about him so often, building churches for the Zulu people in Zululand with his hands. When he retired in his 80s, his hands were all curled up from concrete poisoning, from all of the concrete he poured and the bricks, the blocks that he poured to build these churches. In his lifetime, about 40 churches, raised up national Zulu pastors for those churches and planted them. So I grew up with stories. So when I'm on vacation, when it's true vacation, I hope this doesn't bother you. I don't take theology books with me. I don't take even revival books with me. I take novels with me. Because in a novel, you get caught up. In fact, my favorite novels, and I think I've read everything he ever wrote, but Louis L'Amour and the Western, I loved Louis L'Amour novels, right? And I was almost embarrassed. I've got several degrees. I'm a theologian. I'm a pastor. I should be reading high-level stuff until Dr. Land visited us a few years back and stayed with us in our home and was looking at our bookcase, and he said, "Oh, can I borrow this Louis L'Amour? He's the most brilliant theologian I know." So when I realized he loved Louis L'Amour, I thought because you get absorbed in the story. I become one of the cowboys in the saloon when the land baron is intimidating all of the small ranchers, right? And standing up to the land baron. I'm there. I can outdraw the guy in the black hat when they kick the bar stool over in the saloon and a gunfight breaks out. I'm there, right? And if I run out of Louis L'Amour, I like John Grisham novels. And I'm the little small town attorney who can face down all the big corporate attorneys and win I think we were wired for story. Whether you like them as much as I do or not, I think we were all wired for story because we are able to identify ourselves in the characters of the story. And in the process of that, what God is setting us up for is the understanding that He is working there is a God story going on. And as we move into 2025, I want to encourage you to think through with me some thoughts about your being in the God story. Theologians call it the meta-narrative. And the word meta literally comes from the Greek word that means beyond and behind. So God is working a story that is beyond our story. It's been going on from before the beginning of time. And those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ get invited into this story that is beyond our story and behind our story. And so it would behoove us to understand that the tangible elements of our story, including Pastor Rita having to be back for a month or two until she's back on her feet at an assisted living, including those elements of the story over which sometimes we don't have a lot of control, but they are the details, the tangible details of our story. The danger is looking at the story of our lives with a limited understanding that those tangible elements of the story are the reality of what's going on, and forgetting that we are part, as sons and daughters of God, we are part of a meta-narrative. And it would behoove us to understand what God is doing in the meta-narrative. I sat down on Wednesday when I couldn't go say goodbye to Pastor Rita because the assisted living was in lockdown. I got an invitation for Pastor Jan Hedinger, who used to pastor North Shore Baptist, and they live down there now. And just out of the blue, he called me to just come over and have coffee and chat with him, which I did. And in the process of that conversation, some things he said to me were so specific to my life right now, my circumstances, and my decision process that it could not have been an accident. Before I even got home from his home, I pulled over and texted my family, say, listen to what Pastor Hedinger just said. And I went through the specifics. And the reason it's important, and I share it here, is because without even realizing it, he was speaking the God understanding of the story that is beyond and behind my story. And I want you to understand, as we launch into 2025, there is a meta-narrative that you're a part of. And I obviously don't know all of the stories that you're involved in right now and all of those tangible elements of your story. But it's so important for you and me to understand that God is writing us into His story. And before we jump to any conclusions, and before we make snap decisions, it would behoove us to understand that we are in this. If you're a child of God, if you're not a child of God, there's still elements of His story that are trying to draw you in. But particularly if you're a child of God this morning and you're facing the unknowns of 2025, I don't care what the prognosticators say. I don't care what political pundits say about the future. I don't care about any of those things. I want to know I'm in God's story. What story is God writing? And I want to direct your attention this morning to a fascinating narrative that involves one of the first characters in the Bible that God was able to pull because of Abram's spiritual sensibility. He was able to identify the voice of God, understand that it was the voice of God, and obey the purposes of God in his life. So I want to draw, if you'll allow me, briefly this morning, 4 quick binary decisions that you and I face that I want to glean from Abram's life. Abram was the first biblical character who was spiritually alert enough to understand that God was speaking to him and he was part of God's story. And it's interesting because when you understand Abram, he came from a totally pagan family. a totally pagan, idolatrous background. So there was nothing particular in his background or upbringing that would predispose him to understanding he's in God's narrative. And how do we respond? What's the best way for us to respond when we know that we are in God's narrative? Because God spoke to him at a fairly early age, drew him out of his homeland to leave his family behind, leave his roots behind, and head out someplace brand new that he didn't even know. No maps in those days, no Waze, GPS to tune into. Just think of it, nothing. He just is following God. He's understanding somehow in his communication with God and his sensitivity to God, he caught the vision that he's part of God's story. And so God changes Abram's surroundings. God changes Abram's name later to Abraham. God changed Abram's family and used Abram and Sarah as the beginning of a brand new God family that would later become the nation of Israel. God changed Abram's agenda. God changed everything about Abram's life, which is what you and I have got to be ready for. You know, I've told you this before. If I was writing my life right now, I would be retired in a condominium in Kona. Honestly, the flora and fauna, does that impress you with that? That is exactly like South Africa. The birds sound exactly like South Africa. I love the temperatures. I would, if I was writing my story. But doesn't God have a sense of humor? Because behind and beyond the story that I would write, he's saying, no, I'm going to put you in Seattle, where you see Mount Rainier 3 days a year, right? And like Pastor Eric said, if you're smart, you have an umbrella. And we have an umbrella in our car. I just never get it out. But the thing I hate the most, and when you're bald, it's the worst, right? I see a few bald friends here, is raindrops falling on my head is not a fun song I think of when you don't have any hair to absorb it up there. But God is writing my story. And if I chafed at this and said, why can't I just live in Kona? Why can't I write my life the way I want to? God would chasten me because I'm a child of God. And the tangible elements of my story are not nearly as significant. And this is what I have to hold on to. The tangible elements of my story are not nearly as significant as what God's story is, which is why Pastor Jan Hedinger's words to me last Wednesday were so important. And it was on New Year's Day. So important to me because in the midst of those words, I heard the heart and voice of God. And I knew some things that I've known for a while that I have to be and that I have to do that has nothing to do with Kona as much as I love visiting Kona. But in Genesis 12, Abram did something that we're all tempted to do at one time or another. Genesis 11 is the story of Abram and his father's calling. Genesis 12, Abram is obeying God, doing well so far in the meta-narrative. But he finds himself in a season where there's famine in Canaan, and he reverts to his understanding of the tangible elements of his story and making decisions based on the tangible elements. By the way, there are 4 binary choices, and I missed giving you the first one. The first one is direction over guesswork. Abraham faced the choice in the early part of his life with God in Genesis 12. And the first lesson, the binary choice that we all face in 2025 is direction over guesswork. Do we want to follow God's direction? Are we surrendered to God's direction? Are we tuning in to God's voice in our lives? Or the only other choice is guesswork. Because if I'm making decisions for my future based only on how I perceive the circumstances to be, it's guesswork. If you make decisions about where you're to live or what career you're to have or who you're to marry or how many children all of those things, decisions that we face, if you are making those decisions without getting direction from God, you are living by guesswork. I don't want to face 2025 by guesswork. There's too much at stake in my life and my family to be going by guesswork. I want direction. Well, Abram faltered in chapter 12 and reverted to guesswork, because when the famine hit the land of Canaan, he made a decision, a choice on his own, that he was going to head down to Egypt where he heard there was water. He didn't ask God. He didn't seek God. At this point, Abram's going by guesswork. And you know the story. He gets down there, and apparently Sarah was a hottie. Because when he gets down there, he's so afraid that Pharaoh is going to see Sarah and want to have her as his wife in his harem, and will have Abram killed. Again, what's he doing? He's going by guesswork. He's not seeking God. He's not looking to hear what God's agenda is. He's not trying to line up with God's purposes. He's going by guesswork. And so he decides, in addition to being in Egypt when he had no business being there, he decides he's going to lie about Sarah and tell everybody she's my sister, which in a real technical way was half the truth, but was literally a lie, because Sarah was Abram's wife. So Abram lies about it, which is what happens when you get yourself into a predicament that you've gotten into instead of following God's directions. So he lies about her, and so Pharaoh takes Sarah into his harem, and fortunately, before Pharaoh has a chance to sleep with Sarah, there's a plague. God sends a plague to Pharaoh's household, and Pharaoh only concludes that the plague has come as a result of Sarah, does some questioning of Abram, finds out indeed Sarah is Abram's wife, and with great anger boots Abram, Sarah, and his whole household, Lot included, out of Egypt. So inside these few verses in Genesis 13 now we jump into, Abram heads back to Canaan in some measure of disgrace and very uncertain about his future. Disgrace because he's messed up. And I conclude he's messed up because he's been doing his life based on guesswork instead of seeking God. So inside 18 verses of Genesis 13, Abram returns to God's direction. Listen to this. So Abram, verse 1, chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. So he leaves behind that place of poor decision making and guesswork about his life. He leaves nothing behind in Egypt. Everybody goes with him. He takes everything with him. And that's what I want to say to you. If you find yourself in Egypt, if your decisions have gotten you in Egypt right now just by living life via guesswork, get out of Egypt and don't leave anything behind. Burn your bridges. Get out of Egypt. He leaves nothing behind. Verse 3, as he goes as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly. I forgot to tell you the title of my sermon. I usually don't, because it usually doesn't matter, but Going Back to Go Forward is the title of the sermon. Going back to go forward. Abram goes back to that place in his life that represents to him the voice of God. Bethel is the place that he first landed. They stopped briefly in Shechem, and then he goes to Bethel, and he lands in Bethel, the first semi-permanent place that he and Sarah and Lot and the family live, and he had built an altar there. And Abram goes back to Bethel, back to the last place he heard the voice of God, back to the last place he had God's direction and God's blessing, and he goes back to that altar. Jesus told the church in Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 5 that they'd lost their first love. And he said, what you have to do, he said to them, 3 R's. 1, remember the height from which you've fallen. in Abram's case, if you let me conflate stories, remember Bethel. Remember the voice of God at Bethel. Remember worship at the altar at Bethel. Remember the sacrifices at Bethel. And God says to the church in Ephesus, remember the height from which you've fallen. Repent for having fallen away from that first love that you had and return to the things you did in the beginning. That's exactly what's motivating Abram. He leaves Egypt, the place of bad decisions, and he goes back to the place where he and God met at the altar of worship in Bethel and begins to rebuild his life as part of God's meta-narrative. You know, years ago, and yes, I am getting old, but years ago, Andre Crouch wrote a song. And I know I sang a little bit during the Christmas message, but when I actually prepared this message on the plane on Thursday flying home from leaving Pastor Rita down there. And as I got to this part of the message, thinking about Abraham, and again, I'm a visual learner, and I think I love stories. So I'm thinking about the story of Abraham and what it is that drove Abram back to that altar. And it reminds me of a song that Andre Crouch wrote. Take me back, dear Lord, to the place where I first received you. Take me back, dear Lord, where I first believed. The verse goes like this. I feel like I'm so far from you, Lord, but still I hear you calling me. Those simple things that I once knew, the memories they drawing me. I must confess, Lord, I've been blessed, but yet my soul's not satisfied. Renew my faith, restore my joy, and dry my weeping eyes. Take me back. That's what Abraham did. He thought, I'm going back. I'm going back to that place where I sensed your presence. I'm going back to that place where I heard your voice. I'm going back to that place where you led me and your spirit guided me. I don't want to do Egypt anymore. I don't want to do my way anymore. And verse 4 of chapter 13 says, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. And that Hebrew word for call literally means to cry out, to utter a loud sound. When Abram finally got himself back into the meta-narrative, back into God's story, that's where he chose God's direction over his life. And that place, you only have two choices, direction from God or guesswork in your life, which is why I want to urge you to consider Pastor Ron's basic training for this upcoming term. Direction over guesswork. It's why I want to compel you, if I could possibly, would you make time in your life? If you want to be like Abram, if you want to abandon guesswork and get back to direction. I'm not saying this is the only place you get direction, but can I urge you, Tuesday night, January 14, the first night that we'll have prayer meetings back in the year 2025. Can I encourage you, if you haven't already, make some place in your schedule, make some changes in your life if you need to, and come join us. I know it's only one place in the week, but it's the one place where Westgate puts this message into practice. That's why I keep saying, and my pastoral colleagues keep saying, prayer meeting is the most important gathering in the life of this church. Because it's not Sunday services that's the most important. It's the prayer meeting, because that's where, like Abram, we recognize, no, as a congregation, we're part of a meta-narrative. And I wish I could say I understood that meta-narrative all the time. I wish I could say I led constantly out of a sense of that meta-narrative. But at least I can say to you that your pastoral colleagues and your elders and deacons and I do everything we can to seek God and to cry out to him, just like Abraham did when he got back to that altar. Because we know that the only future this church has, the only future that holds promise for us, is the future that's gained by listening to the voice of God. That happens in our Tuesday night prayer meetings. And I want to encourage you this 2025, come join us. Come find a place of prayer as we seek God together. So the first binary choice is direction versus guesswork. The others won't take as long, so don't panic. Here's the second one: peace over personal gain. Later on in the chapter, apparently Lot's servants and Abram's servants start fighting each other within the family over the disputed land. There wasn't apparently enough land there for all of their flocks to graze, and so a dispute rises up between them. And here's what Abram says: let's not have strife between us. See, when you're going back to the altar, when you understand that your life, my individual life is really insignificant in comparison with the meta-narrative of God. It's not insignificant to God. You're not insignificant, but the tangible elements of my story are insignificant by comparison with the story God's writing. And as Abram is touched at the altar by returning to God, he recognizes that peace is more important than personal gain. So he says to Lot, you go ahead and choose the best fertile ground you want, and you go there with your flocks. I'll go the opposite direction. So if you know the story, you understand Lot chooses Sodom and Gomorrah and the plains of the Jordan River that were and are still fertile, and wonderful place for his flocks. And Lot comes down off of the plateau that is Bethel, down past Jericho, across the Jordan River, and he lands in an area known as Sodom and Gomorrah and chooses that place. Abram chooses peace within the family over his personal preferences. I think that's so important for us today, for 2025. Within our nuclear families, husbands and wives. And I'm not saying peace at the cost of truth. I'm not saying peace at the cost of everything, but I'm saying it's important for us to understand God holds peace and unity at such a high priority that what's happening in your family, you need to choose peace like Abram did in your family over what personal gain might happen to you. One of the best books I ever read on marriage was written by Chuck Swindoll. Strike the Original Match, I think the book was called. And he talks about the fact that the passage in Ephesians that says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And the illustration, in fact, the application that Swindoll makes in that book is that how did Christ love the church? He gave everything of himself. He laid aside everything that he was and literally went to the cross, giving up every personal interest and personal ambition, going to the cross in obedience to the Father so that he could win for himself his bride, the church of Jesus Christ. Swindoll says, husbands, the way we love our wives is to lay down our personal preferences, our personal desires, to make sure that the family, the wife and the family prosper. They are the priority. No, that's not easy for a guy who can be very selfish at times to realize that I got to lay that down. I've got to give priority to Rita and the family, what's best for them, and lay my personal desires aside. That's how you love, right? And that's how you have peace in the family. I'm not saying there's no responsibility for the wife in this process, but basically Abram realizes, because he's part of the meta-narrative of God, he realizes he needs peace rather than his own personal ambition, and chooses peace, letting Lot have the best part. That's the second binary choice. Here's the third binary choice: promise over partnership with the world. When Lot and Abraham went off in different directions, another interesting paradox pops up here. Verse 11 to 13 tells us that Lot took his family and flocks and headed down into what was those days the fertile Jordan River Valley and chose to settle in Sodom. Verse 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Now, if we stop right there, right, we got to say, what in the world was Lot thinking? Did he think for a moment that he could be in this close proximity to a worldly culture, this connected to a worldly culture, and not have it contaminate his family, not have it contaminate his own heart? Did he think he could walk in this close of an alliance with the men and women of Sodom and not eventually lose his wife in the process and later even his family? Did he not think that somehow that was going to affect him? But rather, Abraham, look at what happens to Abraham. When they separate, Lot chooses Sodom, that's filled with wickedness. God says to Abraham, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, north and south and east and west. Look at this. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Abraham chose the promise of God rather than partnership with the world. And interestingly, he ends up in Hebron, far from where Lot was settled. But God, he's holding on to the promise, which is what I was preaching last Sunday, that we've got to walk in an attitude of repentance and constantly shed the contamination of this world, so that our alliance with the Lord and the meta-narrative gives us the promise that God has given us. I want to move into God's promises in 2025. So I can't afford to be in an alliance with this world and the darkness of this world. Then lastly, altar over ambition is the final binary we learn from Abram's life. Abram chooses a region called Hebron. Interestingly, it's the only place I've never been in Israel. It's always been too dangerous to go to Hebron. Lord willing, I understand from Sandy that Israel, all of the sites in Israel are now back open. So I'm praying about taking a tour in 2026. And if I do that, I am going, Lord willing, I'm going to Hebron. If I have to go in an armored car and with a bulletproof vest, I want to go to, it's the only significant place I haven't been. Abram chooses Hebron. It says, then Abram, verse 18, moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. Remember how he first found that base of connection with God was back to Bethel, where the altar was. After the promise of God, and Abram moves into the promises of God, moving north, south, east, west throughout Israel, and decides in Hebron, he builds an altar there, because the altar is where Abram will worship. The altar is where he will sacrifice to the Lord. The altar is where he will meet with the Lord, listen for the voice of the Lord, so he can spend the rest of his life moving in God's meta-narrative. So let me just summarize as I close this morning. Let me summarize the 4 binary choices I want to put to you, Westgate Chapel, for 2025. 1, God's direction over guesswork. Please, if for whatever reason it's impossible for you to join us on Tuesday nights, starting on the 14th, please make prayer and your time in the Word, make an altar. Buy a recliner if you don't have one. It's the best altar I have in my study. But have some place that you routinely and regularly, not just out of habit, but out of a place of communion. I relish going into my study in the mornings and opening up the Word of God and saying, Holy Spirit, what do you have to say to me today? I relish that because I know that's where I'm going to hear his voice. That's where I'm going to be fed. So whether you can make it on Tuesday nights or not, would you, like Abram, have an altar in your life? Create an altar in your life. Create space and time for God in your life. You've got space and time. I'm gonna get nosy here. You got space and time for football. You got space and time for basketball. You got space and time for your hobbies. You got space and time for watching TV. You've got space and time for your meals. If getting in God's meta-narrative is the most important thing for you in 2025, which it is, and the only way into God's meta-narrative is by getting direction, getting close to Him, then why wouldn't you cut out your time on social media daily and make time for Him? Cut out your time in television or your hobbies and make time. Why wouldn't you, if that's the place where you're going to get direction like Abraham did for your life? So God's direction, otherwise you're just walking in guesswork. Number 2, peace in your home, peace in your family, over your personal welfare. That's way more important, that there be peace than you always have things the way you want them. Number 3, God's promise over partnership with the world. I don't have to worry a lot about partnership with the world because of my work environment and my colleagues, and God's blessed us here but many of you are right in the thick of it, which is why things like basic training and being in God's presence and prayer meeting are so important. You're right in the thick of it. How can you be in the world, but like Jesus said, not of the world? That's a challenge. It's a challenge, frankly, that pastors don't face very often. It's a challenge that you're facing. How do you choose God's promise over partnership with the world? How do you choose God's altar over personal ambition? When He brings you to your Hebron, build an altar there. This is my Hebron. God has brought me here very specifically. And Pastor Jan Hedinger spoke very directly into that on Wednesday. This is my Hebron. It is incumbent on me as one of your pastoral staff to build my altar here and do my worshiping and drawing near to God, so that my leadership in 2025 is motivated and moved more by His presence and His voice than what seems right or what's published in books about what churches need to be doing, right? God bless you in this new year. God help you to be like Abram. And even after you've messed up and end up in Egypt, which I've been in Egypt many times, not physically, but I've been in Egypt lots. Nice to be able to walk away from Egypt and know there's an altar to go back to with a loving, merciful God whose arms are open wide, ready to welcome you. Will you stand with me for prayer?